Good evening, and greetings from the southeastern coast of North Carolina. I'm Carol Fink. I'm a distinguished humanities professor emerita at The Ohio State University, as well as professor of history emerita at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. I am very happy to see all of you and to be able to take part in this distinguished series and also to share my current work. Let me, however, start with this admission. Like many scholars, my overseas research was interrupted in March 2020 because of the COVID pandemic. And although I've continued to gather materials online and published an article last year in the International History Review, I have been stopped in doing further overseas research. And so you are going to hear a work in progress. True, I haven't been idle. During this time, I have completely revised and published the third edition of my book on the Cold War. And that's been a great pleasure and very enlightening. But now let's talk to the current study. How and why did it originate? Several years ago, I published this monograph on West Germany and Israel at the very height of the Cold War. And when I was teaching at the University of Sydney in Australia and thinking about my next book project, in the Fisher Library of the University of Sydney, I found a popular German Jewish magazine that said that German Jews would always be grateful to Chancellor Helmut Schmidt for permitting the Soviet Jews to enter the Federal Republic in the 1970s. What? I was intrigued by this surprising and unknown piece of information, especially because most of the literature that we've seen in the past made it very clear that the majority of Soviet Jews had not arrived until much later. I therefore looked further and found in Der Spiegel, national magazine published on November 11th, 1974, a report with these adorable children that announced that 500 Soviet Jews were being housed in West Berlin's Marienfelde refugee camp. Now, if you look at these figures, and this is repeated in most books about the Soviet Jewish exodus and arrival in West Germany, the figure is 0 until the 1990s. And yet what I found is that there was an immigration, not a very large one, several thousand in the 1970s and 80s, that is before unification. Now, why is this important? First, on the diplomatic level, these Soviet Jewish migrants to West Germany were part of the struggle beginning in the late 1960s between the Soviet Union and the West over control over Jewish immigration from the USSR. But second, in the history of migration, these Soviet Jewish arrivals claimed two extraordinary rights. First, they had claimed their right to leave their country, but second, they had claimed their freedom to choose their destination. Third, in contemporary Jewish history, many of these Soviet Jews who had originated in the site of the Nazi slaughter during World War II, and whose government for 2 decades had vilified West Germany as a neo-fascist regime, had not only chosen the land of the murderers in the 1970s and 80s, but they also had intended to claim German citizenship. Fourth, in German Jewish history, these Soviet Jews were able to replenish a diminishing local and national German Jewish community and also added a Russian cultural element in the former capital of Germany. And finally, these unexpected arrivals, probably the most interesting part in some ways, became part of West Berlin and West German history. They created a complex series of diplomatic, national, and local complications and responses. Now, my talk will consist of three parts. First, I will examine the Cold War background, then the migrants themselves, and finally, their impact on their unprepared destination. First, the Jewish emigration from the Soviet Union. Although this exodus of Soviet Jewry is pretty well known, let me briefly review with lots of significant abbreviations some of the salient Cold War history. First, despite Israel's persistent and largely covert efforts after 1948, only tiny numbers of Jews were able to leave the Soviet Union before 1966. Although Soviet law and ideology permitted family reunion, the Kremlin had placed almost insuperable obstacles to leaving. Moreover, after 50 years of Bolshevik rule, except in the borderlands annexed after World War II, the majority of Soviet Jews, unofficially numbering some 3 million and constituting a largely urban, assimilated, well-educated population, many of them intermarried, many of them occupying high-status positions, possess little knowledge of Judaism or of Zionism. But conditions changed in the late 1960s. First, the new Soviet leadership, seeking détente with the West, suddenly announced a liberalized immigration policy. In Paris, on the 18th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1966, Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin stated that the USSR would no longer place obstacles against those attempting to leave the country to reunite with their families. Second, Israel's spectacular victory in the June 1967 war kindled strong religious and national sentiments, especially among the Jews in the Soviet borderlands. And it also kindled a severe anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist backlash by the Kremlin that hurt Soviet Jews. And third, by the late 1960s, due to a spate of domestic policies, Soviet Jews suddenly found themselves increasingly marginalized, encountering restrictions, formal and informal, to their and their children's educational, professional, and other opportunities. They experienced a glass ceiling, accompanied by more competitive and, in some cases, a more hostile environment. Also, the Soviet Jews' awakening coincided with the swelling of the Soviet human rights movement. However, the Jews were a movement to leave, not to reform the USSR, or even simply to mitigate the conditions of its Jewish minority. However, despite Moscow's assurances, Jewish applications to leave encountered major obstacles, not only the arduous paperwork and expense, but also an overwhelming number of refusals by Soviet authorities, which are not yet calculated to this day. And these refusals were ostensibly based on protecting state secrets or on the applicant's failure to secure the family's permission, but in most cases, no reason was given at all. They thus developed the refusnik phenomenon. The activist Soviet Jews who, invoking the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 1966 UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, both of which the USSR had signed, which stated unequivocally, everyone shall be free to leave any country, including his own. And they demanded this right for themselves. The refusniks came to world attention with their protests, their civil disobedience, hunger strikes, samizdat tracts, press conferences with foreign journalists, petitions to the Soviet government and to foreign governments and to the UN. By 1969, an international grassroots campaign to free Soviet Jewry had developed. Israel under Prime Minister Golda Meir, which hitherto had only quietly promoted Jewish migration by facilitating the family reunion process, now went public. And well-organized American Jews launched a national and global campaign. Using biblical language, let my people go. This was not only an attempt to rescue a seemingly endangered community and bring them to Israel. It was a Cold War crusade against Moscow, enlisting governments, labor leaders, and church groups, and extending the demand from family unification to unlimited immigration. One major international episode was the 1970 trial of 12 Soviet Jewish activists who had plotted an airline hijacking, but in which 2 of the death sentences were reduced as a result of Western protests. Even more spectacular was the February 1971 Brussels Conference on Soviet Jewry, a 2-day gathering of some 750 Jewish leaders from 40 countries demanding freedom to leave. The Soviet government, while denouncing the refuseniks as traitors and lambasting this interference in its domestic affairs, vacillated over its response. An almost evenly divided Politburo debated the advantages of releasing the troublemakers versus the diplomatic risks of expanding their numbers, namely anticipating protests from Moscow's Arab allies, along with the economic and political consequences of losing highly educated professionals, and also encouraging other minority groups to demand similar treatment. In the early stages of détente, the Kremlin followed an inconsistent policy. The figures are here. Dramatically increasing the number of exit permits from 4,235 between 1968 and 1970 to 13,000 in 1971 to almost 32,000 in 1972 and almost 35,000 in 1975, but also raising the number of refusals. And in 1972, instituting the notorious diploma tax, forcing Jewish immigrants to repay the cost of their higher education. Also, Moscow unleashed a propaganda campaign stressing the Jews' happiness in the USSR and their unhappiness in Israel, as witnessed by the 400 to 500 emigres who requested a return to their homeland. Now, despite mounting international and local pressure, US President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, who were avidly seeking détente with the Soviet Union and a nuclear agreement, which they sweetened with a trade and investment agreement, both were highly reluctant to intervene diplomatically on behalf of Soviet Jews. But Congress did. In 1973, Senator Henry Jackson and Congressman Charles Bannock, riding the wave of outrage over the diploma tax, threatened to remove the Soviet Union from most favored nation status unless it allowed entirely free immigration. Henry Kissinger, who had failed to thwart Congress's initiative, also failed to convince Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko to set an annual figure. Jackson had proposed 60,000 Soviet Jews per year. Nonetheless, in December 1973, the US Congress overwhelmingly passed the Jackson-Bannock Amendment, along with a more punitive clause curtailing investment credits in the seemingly cash-strapped Soviet Union. But the Kremlin, although it quietly dropped the diploma tax, refused to be cowed. In fact, profiting from its increased gas and oil revenues after the October 1973 Middle East War, and subsequently from its oil and gas arrangements with Western Europe and Japan, which had no codicils about Soviet Jews. It simply renounced the US trade agreement. The signing of the final Act of Helsinki in August 1975 culminated the détente era, and it also signaled a potential easing of Soviet Jewish immigration. Bastille III, which included the right of freedom of movement, raised hopes and in some places fears of more Soviet Jews leaving the country. And after the Kremlin unexpectedly published the Helsinki text applications for exits swelled, whereupon the Soviet Ministry of the Interior simplified and liberalized some of the rules and even quietly dropped the restriction of family reunion. Moreover, the final act established an ongoing international review process, which gave the US, under the Carter and Reagan administrations, an opportunity to continue to apply pressure on Moscow. Nonetheless, the Brezhnev government continued to insist on the inviolability of the Soviet Union's domestic jurisdiction over immigration, restricting the numbers in 1976 and 77, raising them between 1977 and 1980, most dramatically, as you'll see, in 1979. That was the big year. But then dropping them precipitously in 1981. And it was only under Gorbachev, as you'll see, that the numbers began to rise again in 1988. The upshot of this Cold War struggle is as follows. Despite the intermittent and the inconsistent US and international pressure, Soviet leaders in the Cold War retained exclusive control over the numbers and the selection of Jewish immigrants, which rose and fell erratically, depending on internal or external circumstances, depending on which historian you read. To be sure, I look forward to a time, and I've been assured by my Moscow colleagues that it may happen, when I will be able to go to Moscow and look at some of the Soviet documents on this and acquire even more information on Soviet policymaking and bureaucratic decision-making on this granting or refusal of exit permits. And this will considerably enhance my work. All right, part two. The prized exit permit from the Soviet Union, shown here, is a 1979 document of the 25-year-old Elena Kassel, was obtained after an arduous vetting procedure that included assembling a massive amount of documentation, waits of up to 2 or 3 years or even more. And once in possession of this permit, Soviet Jews had to renounce their citizenship, generally for a fee, and carry a limited amount of personal property on their journey. Moreover, when the Soviet Union broke diplomatic relations with Israel in 1967, and there were no longer direct flights between Moscow and Tel Aviv, Soviet Jews then had to undertake the arduous journey to Vienna, either by plane, if they could afford it, or by rail, a 2-day trip, where they were then brought by agents of officials of the Jewish agency to Schernau. This was a transit center outside Vienna where they were processed, where they received their paperwork, and where they then proceeded on their flight to Israel. However, the exodus of Soviet Jewry was dramatically and utterly transformed at the end of 1973. And this came in the wake of a terrorist attack on the morning of September 28th, 1973, when 2 heavily armed Palestinians seized, actually 5, not 3 in this article, Soviet Jews as their train crossed the Czechoslovak border into Austria and demanded a plane to take them and their hostages to an Arab country. Austria's Chancellor, Bruno Kreisky, who had long considered Schernau a security risk, negotiated the freeing of the hostages in return for the closure of Schernau. This had become a very, very controversial place, a real security risk. There'd been several attempted attacks on Schernau. And the pleas of Golda Meir, the protests of other leaders, and of Nixon himself were to of no avail. When they arrived in Vienna, Soviet Jews were now placed in a Red Cross transit center, no longer under the control of the Jewish agency, where they could, for the first time, choose their destination. Thus, The Soviet Jews who arrived in West Berlin, in my story, fell into two distinct categories. There were those who had gone to Israel and decided to leave, and there were those who so-called dropped out, either in Vienna or later on in Rome. Now, those who left Israel, they were derogatively labeled Yordim. Those who left Israel, their numbers began to rise steadily from 1973 to 1976 for a variety of personal, economic, and political reasons. They stirred considerable disgruntlement among the Israeli public and officials. After all, Israel had made it possible for them to leave the Soviet Union, had produced the indispensable invitations, had provided the travel documents, had expended considerable sums on their absorption, and even amended the nationality law to grant citizenship to non-Jewish spouses and children. Moreover, those who decided to leave faced a difficult process, especially those who had only spent a short period of time in Israel, who had to repay some of the funds they had been given. They did not possess an official Israeli passport. They lacked a visa for their next destination. And they were no longer considered refugees, and therefore were denied support by such Jewish agencies as HIAS and the JDC. They had to turn either to non-Jewish agencies, to Catholic Charities, to the Tolstoy Foundation, or to carry on in their own. Now, the second group were those who dropped out in Vienna. In Hebrew, they were called the Noshrim, who had decided for several reasons not to go on to Israel. Among them, and most prominently, probably the greater economic opportunities for them and their children elsewhere, particularly in the US. US aid workers, interestingly enough, and I've interviewed a couple of them, also suspected that the Soviet authorities, for propaganda reasons as well as to assuage Arab protests, had begun to select applicants more likely to drop out. But we'll have to see what the Moscow archives tell about this. In any event, despite the rise and fall of exit permits, what we see in this chart is that the number of dropouts from Vienna or Rome rose steadily in the 1970s, reaching by 1977 almost half the Soviet Jews who'd been allowed to leave the Soviet Union. Moreover, despite Israel's protests and its efforts to divert the exiting Soviet Jews to a transit place other than Vienna, the US government and American Jewish aid agencies strongly defended the Soviet Jews' freedom of choice. Subsidized by the US government, they provided the dropouts with material assistance in Vienna, transportation to a facility outside Rome, where they awaited the responses to their visa applications from the US and even possibly from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, where of course they had to wait a lot longer. Also, and this is interesting, US aid officials, many of whom at this time were either children or relatives of Holocaust survivors, tracked the second level of dropouts in Vienna and in Rome, those who dropped out a second time and headed for West Germany, and took a rather dim view of their destination. Now, how did the Soviet Jews reach West Berlin in November 1974? The majority who had come from Israel had found the means, one way or another, to fly from Tel Aviv to Frankfurt or to Munich, and had then proceeded either by plane or train to Berlin. Only a few with visas. The smaller number of dropouts had to be more resourceful, either hiring drivers in Vienna or proceeding to Rome, where they switched destinations, procured rail or plane tickets or some other means of transportation, and headed north. Now, on the surface, this choice was unthinkable, especially, as I mentioned earlier, that many of these early Soviet Jewish migrants had been born in the Soviet borderlands, the very sites of the Nazi slaughter of their kindred in the Second World War. Moreover, until the Moscow Treaty of 1970 that had sort of crowned the beginning of West German Soviet Ostpolitik, the Soviet government had routinely vilified West Germany as a militarist, neo-fascist regime filled with Nazis. However, the advent of Ostpolitik, that is, Willy Brandt's ambitious outreach to his communist neighbors when his government was formed in 1969, and especially the chancellor's kneeling gesture in December 1970 before the Warsaw Ghetto Monument, had substantially altered the federal government's image in the communist world. And since that time, there had been increased east-west trade, east-west personal and economic relations, and the reestablishment of family and professional contacts. Nonetheless, why West Berlin is a destination? Although physically isolated, it was lying deep inside East Germany, encircled by a 96-mile wall, accessible only by 3 prescribed corridors and air routes. It was an attractive destination. It was a very attractive destination. Despite its declining population since the wall had been built in 1961, West Berlin was still the largest West German city with almost 2 million inhabitants. Rebuilt after the war in US modernist design and with US money as a modern capitalist showplace in contrast with its poor eastern neighbor, heavily subsidized by the federal government, shielded by the 3 Western powers, with no military draft, West Berlin had become a prominent cultural, intellectual, and industrial center with relatively inexpensive housing, an excellent transportation system. It was an 185 square mile metropolis with beautiful forests and lakes, and as well as a youthful counterculture, a glittering nightlife that reminded visitors of Weimar. Also, thanks to its longtime SPD-led government and generous federal subsidies, West Berlin was renowned for its liberal social services. And Marienfelde, the model transit center built by the US for refugees from the East, had excellent facilities. And Marienfelde was an ideal place. This is what was pictured in the Spiegel article for the Soviet Jews to begin their stay. But even more important, West Berlin was the location of the Federal Republic's largest Jewish community, numbering some 5,000 people. It was led by the 62-year-old Heinz Galinski, a survivor of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen, who had lost his wife and parents during the war, but had decided to return and stay in West Berlin. Galinski, an indefatigable advocate, organizer, and fundraiser, had already induced the West Berlin government to aid the needy, to build this community center, to rebuild schools and synagogues. He wrote frequently in the German and European press, continually warning the German public against forgetting the horrors of Auschwitz. And perhaps his most important accomplishment on January 9th, 1971, was to convince the West Berlin Senate, the first of any West German land, to grant legal recognition to the Jewish community, establishing its parity with the city's Protestants and Catholics, ensuring religious freedom and financial assistance. Also, there were 2 dynamic German Jewish organizations, the Frankfurt-based Central Council of the Jews in Germany, representing the community in the capital and internationally, and led by the Karlsruhe businessman Werner Nachmann, and also the Central Welfare Office of the Jews in Germany, which coordinated Jewish charities and distributed government aid to needy Jewish communities. Despite its small numbers, West Germany's Jewish community, which numbered some 28,000 in a population of 62 million, was known as a moral authority, reminding the nation of its past. To be sure, life in West Berlin was not without its dangers. Initially, the threat had come from the neo-Nazis, who after 1945 had routinely vandalized synagogues, communal buildings, and cemeteries. But by the late 1960s, left-wing militants had also turned against the Jews. On November 9th, 1969, a bomb was found in the Jewish Community Center. And the presence of thousands of Palestinian refugees in West Berlin, plus the establishment of a PLO office in East Berlin, increased the sense of danger. Above all, the Soviet Jewish arrivals in West Berlin, after successfully claiming their right to leave the Soviet Union and to choose their destination, faced another obstacle. Like Israel, West Germany defined citizenship purely in ethno-cultural terms. According to Article 116 of the 1949 Basic Law, this citizenship included all Germans in East and West Germany, as well as those who had fled or been expelled from Eastern Europe after World War II. And like Israel, West Germany had no formal immigration procedure for non-Germans, and an unusually long 10-year period for naturalization, requiring rigorous language and other qualifications. Thus, the millions of guest workers in West Germany at that time had scant hope of ever attaining citizenship, nor did the tens of thousands of Middle East and Asian refugees who had been reluctantly admitted into the country in the 1970s. But there was this extraordinary loophole for the Soviet Jews: to enter, to remain, and to obtain special privileges, and that was to claim a German heritage. Under West Germany's 1953 law, the Bundesvertriebenengesetz, abbreviated BVFG, the post-war provision for the millions of Germans expelled from Eastern Europe was extended to those who had continued to arrive in the country from the former Eastern territories of the German Reich, as well as to members of historic German communities in Eastern Europe, enabling them to qualify for an expellee card, and with that, to immediately receive German citizenship and preference for housing, jobs, and social services, including unemployment insurance and pensions. And notably, the terms for receiving this expellee document were unusually subjective. Somebody who had identified him or herself as belonging to the German community in his or her country of birth. And notably, Jews were not excluded. To be sure, the BVFG required a massive amount of paperwork and witness testimony. Almost all the Soviet Jews, both the leavers and the dropouts, who arrived in West Berlin in the early 1970s, attended to apply for the expellee card, claiming their knowledge of the German language, education in German institutions, participation in German clubs and workplaces, and their deep knowledge of German folklore and culture. And indeed, there was a precedent. East European Jews who had been arriving in West Germany in the 50s and 60s had successfully applied for the expellee card. And there was indeed a Frankfurt-based Association of Jewish Expellees and Refugees, which was a strong lobbying institution. And Galinsky was well prepared to support the Soviet Jews who were claiming a German identity. However, those unable to prove this were in a quandary. Jews arriving from Israel could not claim to be refugees. People forced to flee because of persecution, war, or violence. And those arriving from Vienna or Rome without any passport or papers were subject to expulsion, unless exceptions could be made by the local authorities. And West Berlin and West Germany's still small Jewish community, despite all their government subsidies, the ambition and talents of their leaders and their press, were in fact an aging and modestly endowed and politically diffident population, which was unused to mounting local or national campaigns. And thus, the 500 Soviet Jews described in the Spiegel article now faced an encounter with West Berlin and West German officialdom. Now I move to the third part, the West German response to this unexpected arrival and to the ever-present threat of more to come. The Spiegel article created a highly disagreeable and even menacing challenge for the West Berlin and West German governments. Earlier, between 1969 and 1974, the Willy Brandt government, pursuing the ambitious Ostpolitik, had been extremely reluctant to intervene on behalf of the Soviet Jews. The chancellor had aggressively pressed Moscow and Warsaw for German immigration from the USSR and Poland, but had been relatively silent about the Jews. On the other hand, local officials in West Berlin, as Jews began to arrive there after 1972, had informally and quietly made exceptionally liberal decisions on their BVFG applications because, as the governing mayor Klaus Schutz later became the FRG's ambassador to Israel, because, as he explained, of our recent history. However, by 1974, conditions in West Berlin and in West Germany had changed dramatically. There was not only a new chancellor, Helmut Schmidt, but also a major economic slowdown in the wake of the 1972 oil crisis. Moreover, the unexpected number of Soviet Jewish arrivals now raised practical security and diplomatic problems. Marienfelder became quickly filled, and the newcomers were scattered in Red Cross centers throughout the city, where the overcrowded, sometimes horrible conditions raised negative comments from neighbors and the local press. Also, remembering Schernau and Munich 2 years earlier, the West Berlin government feared to create ghetto conditions or a terrorist attack. Moreover, if the Jackson-Bannock Amendment succeeded, the number of Soviet Jewish arrivals in West Berlin would surely swell, posing potential diplomatic complications with the Soviet Union, which after all had an occupation force in Berlin, and also with Israel and with the Arab world. Now, the 1949 West German Constitution specified that decisions on whether and what terms legal and illegal foreigners could remain in the Federal Republic and fill the requirements of citizenship were to be determined by the 11 states or Länder, in which for these purposes, West Berlin was included. However, in special cases involving fundamental questions of immigration law and policy, the Federal Ministry of the Interior would become involved. Moreover, as suggested earlier, there were diplomatic consequences, and for West Germany, a historical dimension, which would immediately bring in the foreign ministry. Now, significantly, both federal ministries, Interior and the Foreign Ministry, were led by members of the tiny right of center, but indispensable for coalition building Free Democratic Party. The Interior Minister was the jurist Werner Mayhofer. The Foreign Ministry, the Auswärtiges Amt, was run by Hans-Dietrich Genscher. And both, as much of their generation born in the 1920s, were former Hitler Jugend and Nazi Party members, as well as Wehrmacht veterans, but whose records were among those that had been hidden by the US occupation authorities in an effort to build a new and democratic federal republic. Not unexpectedly, The West Berlin Jewish leader Galinsky had long established ties with these Free Democrats. And not only did he immediately reach out to the local West Berlin SPD on the crisis of the Soviet Jews, but also very directly to Genscher, urging him to apply a generous welcome to the Soviet Jews. And it seemed to work. Although the Interior Ministry remained neutral, the Foreign Ministry's response over how to deal with the arrivals strongly opposed expulsion and expressed unconcern over Soviet or Arab or US or even Israeli reactions. Although foreign ministry officials, and this is ironic in view of recent German history since 2015, did admit that making too many exceptions might attract more Soviet Jews and raise diplomatic risks, Genscher insisted, perhaps convinced by the small numbers, perhaps by Galinsky's appeal, conceivably through an intervention from the Chancellor's office. The answer to that, of course, still resides in the Helmut Schmidt papers in Bonn. Anyway, Genscher insisted that West Germany, from a historic, moral, and humanitarian perspective, had an obligation not to force the Soviet Jews, even those who had arrived illegally, either to return to Israel or to leave for another country. Consequently, responding to the immediate housing and public relations emergency, the West Berlin government devised a stopgap measure. On December 3rd, 1974, the Senate announced that all Soviet Jews residing in the city would be allowed to stay and receive residence and work permits. But beginning on the very next day, all new arrivals could stay for a maximum of 6 months unless they qualified for an expellee card under the BVFG. Galinsky, who had participated actively in these deliberations, was satisfied. But because of the local Jewish community's resources were now overstretched, he also urged Mayor Schutz to press the other German states to admit a proportionate number of Soviet Jews. The public reactions to Berlin's stopgap measures, this is, by the way, Galinsky meeting with Genscher. The public reactions to Berlin's stopgap measures were mostly positive. In the federal parliament, the Bundestag, there were questions, but no major objections. The West German press approved the city's decision, but also approved the curb on unlimited illegal immigrants. One dissenting journalist, however, called it a shameful surrender in the place where the Jewish tragedy had originated. Abroad, the Israeli government quietly concurred, although the press deplored this concession to the Soviet Jewish deserters. And US journalists, while expressing some misgivings over the end of a relatively permissive regime, displayed an understanding of the city's plight. But over the next year, the weakness of West Berlin's stopgap measure became evident. Although the Kremlin drastically reduced the number of exit permits in 1975, Jews continued to leave Israel, to drop out in Vienna, and to arrive in West Berlin, while at the end of the year, at least 300 more had arrived. With rising inflation, mounting unemployment, and 2 major terrorist incidents that year, the problem of Soviet Jews somewhat faded into the background. Nevertheless, it had to be faced. And West Germany's 10 federal states, for complicated and practical reasons, declined to coordinate their immigration policies with West Berlin or to accept the new arrivals. And to Galinsky and Schutz's immense frustration, Interior Minister Mayhofer refused to intervene to tighten border restrictions, insisting and foreshadowing, by the way, Germany's quandary today over COVID restrictions, that according to the Constitution, the states, not the federal government, had the power to decide who could enter and who could stay. Still, the diplomatic repercussions remained manageable. The foreign ministry continued to oppose the expulsions and declined to put pressure on Israel to obstruct the leavers. The Kremlin, which was exploiting the growing number of leavers and dropouts in its anti-Israel propaganda, appeared undisturbed by the Jewish migration to the Federal Republic. And despite Bonn's concern, did not reduce the number of ethnic Germans that it was releasing at the same time. Nor did Poland diminish its agreed upon release of thousands of ethnic Germans, among them some Jews, and many of whom ended up in Marienfelde next to the Soviet Jews. Despite the grumbles of the Israeli press, its government remained officially silent, at least as far as I can tell from the German records I have seen, and until I have access to Israeli archives. During the two high-profile visits in 1975, one by Foreign Minister Yigal Allon, the other by Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, neither, according to the German records, mentioned the Soviet Jews. Both sought Bonn's support in a European community heavily dependent on Arab oil, and which was tilting increasingly towards the Palestinians. But Rabin, who was the first native-born head of state and the first to visit the Federal Republic, and his German-born wife, Leah, did make an emotional visit to Bergen-Belsen, and they also flew to West Berlin, where, under extremely high security, they not only toured the city, but they also met with its Jewish community, including, I presume, some Soviet Jews. By the summer of 1975, there was another housing crisis and a rising number of refusals for the expellee document. West Berlin's solution, following traditional bureaucratic practice, was to appoint a study commission, which, after sounding out federal officials and Israeli government officials, recommended once more that all the residing Soviet Jews be allowed to stay quietly. Thus, the West Berlin Senate secretly adopted another stopgap measure, giving permanent resident status and work permits to those who had arrived before November 18, 1975, and who within 10 years would be eligible for German citizenship, justifying this exceptional measure with the positive development in relationship with Germans and Jews. However, they also made this notable, although impractical, proviso that every effort be made to convince the Federal Republic's diplomatic representatives, especially in Vienna and Rome, to contain this uncontrolled migration to West Berlin. Nonetheless, from that time onward, Soviet Jews continued to arrive in the city. Jewish exits from the Soviet Union, which, as mentioned earlier, had quietly dropped the family reunion requirement, peaked at more than 51,000 in 1979, and by 1980, the West Berlin Jewish population had risen to 6,300. The Jewish community continued to receive its annual subvention, and in response to Galinsky's plea, the local government reduced the waiting time for citizenship to 8 years. However, the welcoming atmosphere was greatly diminishing. Soviet Jews who submitted BVFG applications faced increasingly negative decisions, which Galinsky was unable to reverse. The wait for permanent residence was long and arduous. But above all, there was a major scandal that rocked the community: the discovery of an international counterfeiting ring that had been selling false documents in Israel and in Europe, cleansing the migrants' time in Israel, creating fake antecedents. And after the local authorities in Berlin re-examined 1,300 BVFG applications dating all the way back to 1976, there were scores of arrests and several hundred Soviet Jews were threatened with deportation. Now, this topic requires further delving into local and federal Interior Ministry records, both in Berlin and Koblenz, and many, many applications for exemption from federal privacy rules, and it's going to take more time to delve into this. But as a result, the West Berlin government, although refraining from expelling most of the false paper holders, decided to end its toleration of the illegal immigration. After September 22nd, 1980, only those Soviet Jews arriving from Israel with a valid passport and visa could be eligible to apply for residence, although family members could still join their relatives in West Berlin. Galinsky fully supported the crackdown. The Berlin Jewish community's resources were exhausted. Its members' patience had been tested by the difficulties in integrating many of the new arrivals. And once more, Galinsky pleaded for help from the Jewish communities elsewhere in the Federal Republic. Relief came in the 1980s when, after the Soviet Union sharply reduced the number of exit permits, the arrivals in West Berlin began to sharply diminish. Moreover, Soviet Jews began settling elsewhere, in Offenbach, Frankfurt, Munich, Cologne, and other cities, where the Jewish communities became more and more welcoming. And some Soviet Jews, if they could, departed for the US or Canada. Nonetheless, on the eve of the German unification in 1990, or reunification as some people call it, the West Berlin Jewish community now stood at 6,900, the largest in the Federal Republic, and the total number of Jews in the country had risen to 30,000. The majority of Soviet Jewish arrivals, including several that I have interviewed before 1920, had settled in. They had found jobs. They had educated their children in German schools. They had become citizens, and they had found a new homeland in one still called the land of the murderers. Now for some concluding thoughts. First, in Cold War history, I think I can turn this off now. In Cold War history, the Soviet Jews, despite their small numbers between 1972 and 1989, definitely added to the period's human rights discourse with their demand for an unrestricted right to leave, something incidentally, despite numerous international agreements that not all countries permitted or to this day permit. The Soviet Union's refusal of this demand, which remained a major East-West issue throughout this period, was a signal victory for the Kremlin. Moreover, Moscow's opaque, arbitrary, and often erratic decision-making on the exit visas not only disrupted East-West relations, but also kept Soviet Jews, their proponents, and their potential hosts, especially West Berlin and West Germany, continually on balance. 2, the Soviet Jews who arrived in West Berlin from 1972 onward, either leaving Israel or coming directly out of the USSR, were, as I mentioned, technically not refugees. They were not driven out from their homeland. They had chosen to leave a difficult, even menacing homeland. Those who had gone to Israel could certainly not claim a flight from an oppressive regime. But both groups, those who left Israel and those who dropped out, insisted on a new and unique right, their freedom to choose and to select their destination. Now, several factors had influenced their choice of West Berlin. The unique political, economic, and demographic character of that city, the cultural advantages of remaining in Europe, West Germany's extraordinary admission procedures, which were adjudicated by the individual lender, which involved ethnic Germans. There was also the earlier arrival of Soviet and East European Jews and their own relatives, but especially the weight of the country's recent Nazi past, which made local and national government officials reluctant to treat them as the unwanted. They arrived in a city known for its generosity, and being Jewish placed them in a special category for exceptional consideration, even when, as we have seen, their testing of West German law produced irregular results. And yet, despite their small numbers and their minimal affiliation with Judaism, these Soviet Jews also contributed to the revival of Jewish life in West Berlin and in West Germany. They created what some of my interviewees have also called a third wave of Russian culture in the center of Europe. They replenished communities depleted by assimilation, death, and immigration. They stirred a humanitarian reaction by local and federal government, and they mobilized, at least for a time, the Jewish leadership on their behalf. To be sure, the behavior of criminal elements also stirred a backlash to their presence, and this did not disappear after 1990, when, after the US changed its entry laws, new terms had to be established for the admission of the huge Soviet Jewish exodus after German unification. And last, for the West Berlin and the West German governments, this unexpected and until now largely unknown arrival of several thousand Soviet Jews in the 1970s and 1980s occurred at an extremely difficult time. Diplomatically, because of the diminishing economic and political gains from Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, the faint prospects of a Middle East peace, and also domestically because of the economic downturn and the outbreak of domestic terrorism. In sum, the Soviet Jews raised potential security and diplomatic complications. They divided and perturbed local and national authorities. They produced contested court decisions and criminal investigations, and occasionally sensationalist press reportage, along with divisions among the states and even the Jewish community. Nonetheless, based on my preliminary research, there is no question that West Berlin and the other states and the federal government of West Germany all granted exceptional treatment to the Soviet Jews, especially compared with their far harsher treatment of the Turkish guest workers and all the refugees and asylum seekers in the country from Chile and Vietnam and the Middle East and elsewhere. But the question remains whether these erratic but generally permissive decisions by West Berlin and West Germany in the 1970s and 80s were driven by atonement for the past, by the extremely small numbers, by a shift in the debate that was going on between the ethnic state and the liberal state, was simply by practical concerns, or a combination of all of these things. Will, when overseas travel becomes safer and possible than it is now, this will require further investigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. There are a few questions. H. Redding asked, please repeat and expand the brief reference to an article by Professor Fink in Journal of European History. I wish the complete reference so as to research and read the article. Thanks.
Oh, the article is in the International History Review. I guess if the person sends me an email, I will send the exact reference. Would that work?
Could you type your email in the chat so that people might send you?
Sure. I will do that. I will do that. Okay.
Thank you. The next question is by Gladwin, who asks, what proof of Jewish origin did the immigrants have to present to Soviet and or Israeli authorities in order to leave?
Well, let's see. For the Soviet authorities, Jew was stamped on their internal passport. And that actually, we could talk about that, but that became quite a to-do in the 70s and 80s, since being a Jew was practically the only way one could leave the Soviet Union. Sometimes this designation could become somewhat questionable. The second part was to get into Germany.
Well, it wrote Israel, but Germany is also a good question.
Well, the German government wasn't so interested in whether they were Jewish. The thing that was being litigated was whether they could claim to be German under the BVFG, whether they had this German background and culture and all of that. Their Jewishness was not in question, although, and I've read some of the court records on this, although in some of the contestation, in some of the decisions, Jewishness did come up. No, once they got to Germany and they were demanding this, or they were claiming this right of German heritage, their Jewishness really had nothing to do with it at all.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question. Gladwin asked, what is the current status of people wishing to leave Russia, Jewish or not?
Oh, I don't think it's a problem at all. I mean, I think immigration, is not a problem in Russia, or I don't know about any of the other succession states. I think people are, fairly free to leave unless they get arrested or something like that before they try to leave.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you all for being with us this evening or morning, wherever you may be. And there are no holidays for a while now, but we just finished Hanukkah, so Hanukkah Sameach. Laila Tov.
Goodbye to all.